Okay. All right, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to finish up chapter 4 today. Talked about demand on Wednesday. Today, we're going to talk briefly about supply. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on supply. And then we're going to very quickly move to markets because that's where the good stuff's at. So supply by definition, how much producers are willing and able to sell per period at each possible price, all other things constant. You've heard something like this before, right? When we defined supply or demand the first time, and it said how much consumers are willing and able to buy. This is actually the exact same thing, except for we've put producers and how much they're willing and able to sell in there instead. So it's pretty much the same definition. You must be, but from the opposite side, from the supply side. You have to be willing and able. You got to pick a time period. It includes all possible prices that good would be produced and supplied at. And then we did that, all other things constant, that sort of disclaimer that says that we don't want to account for small variables. We just can't. Okay? Don't overthink this. Pretty straightforward. Supply also has a law, the laws of supply. It's a little bit shorter, a little bit less complicated than the law of demand. But the basic gist of this is that the quantity supplied is directly related to price. So they move in the same direction, which means that as price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. As price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. And that makes sense. If you're a supplier and the price you can get goes up, well, that's more profit. So the quantity you want to supply goes up too. It's like if I asked you to supply me, chocolate chip cookies, right? As the price goes up, more of you become willing to spend the time, right, to produce those. It also makes more of you able to produce because you can go out and buy all the things you need. Let's say you didn't have all the supplies you needed to bake chocolate chip cookies. The higher the price gets, the more you're willing and the more you're able to supply those things because you can buy the resources you need and your profits go up. Okay? Feel free to bring me cookies anytime. Okay. And so this is just a terminology thing. Okay? We have to make sure we keep terminology straight in this class. There are very small terminology differences that really seem to mess students up on exams. Okay, so this is just me sort of making sure we have that down. This goes for demand too. Like demand equals market demand and supply equals market supply. So when we throw out just the word demand or just the word supply, we're talking about all the information that sits all along that entire curve. Okay? When we talk about quantity supplied or quantity demanded, as the case may be, we're really talking about a very specific point on that curve. There's a big difference between supply and quantity supplied. Supply is all the information. Quantity supplied is one teeny tiny piece of information on the curve. If I ask you to give me quantity supplied, what should be the question you have back to me? I say, give me quantity supplied. What would you say? Yeah, thank you. What price are you talking about? I need a price if you want a quantity supplied, because the quantity supplied is, right, directly linked to every single price along that curve. If I give you price, you can tell me quantity supplied at that price. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. A shift in supply, just like a shift in demand, is going to be the movement of the entire curve in one direction or another, increase or decrease to the right, to the left. Movement of a supply curve and movement along a supply curve are two totally different things. Movement of would be the whole curve. Movement along would just be finding a different place on that existing curve, a different price. All right. So here's just, and this is, I gave you demand schedule and a demand curve for the pizza market. This is the same exact market, except for we're doing the supply side here. So you can see we have those same pizza prices, those same 5 prices. And then in a supply schedule, we would just have the corresponding quantity supplied at those prices. And you can see they move in the same direction. Price goes up, quantity supplied goes up, and vice versa. Then you can see we have that upward sloping supply curve. We've just taken those 5 points and we've plotted them and connected them. It's upward sloping. 95% of supply curves will have some sort of an upward slope. Not all of them, right? And we'll talk about those in the next chapter, some of the exceptions, but for the purpose of this class, you can assume they're all upward sloping unless you're told something different. Why doesn't this supply curve go to the origin? Why doesn't the supply curve start at 0, 0? Why does it stop at like $1.25 or something like that? That $1.25, what does that mean? Why does it stop there? Any thoughts? Most supply curves don't go to the origin. Lowest they will sell them. Why is that the lowest? Any thoughts? You're right, Cayman. That's true. But why is that the lowest price they'll sell at? Because it's the cost of goods, right? That usually gives me some indication about the minimum cost, exactly, won't make a profit, the minimum cost that that a pizza supplier has. Does that make sense? Yeah, if you think about the actual cost of producing a pizza, it could probably be as low as $1.25, right? There's some supplier out there that produces a pretty inexpensive pizza. They can't sell it for lower than that because it wouldn't make any sense, right? Wouldn't make any sense because they wouldn't make any profit. And so they're not willing to supply anything below that $1.25 price. Yes, lowest price to make cost of goods, just to break even. That's probably somebody's break-even point. It's not everybody's break-even point. But there's a supplier somewhere in that market, right, who's willing to supply $3 pizzas and even $2 pizzas, and probably even pizzas at $1.50. But you get down to like that, I don't know, it's $1.25, something like that, and all of a sudden they're out too. Okay, wouldn't make any money. Good. All right, so let's talk about the 5 reasons we would see a shift in the supply curve. You're not going to get an additional slide for each of these like you did with demand. So you're going to have to make notes right here. Okay, there's no further notes anywhere in my PowerPoint. So these are kind of self-explanatory. There's 1 or 2 of them that are a little tricky. What would shift a supply curve? Well, the first thing, the big thing, is a change in technology, right? Technology has a way of making us much more efficient and giving us the ability to supply more, the ability to produce more. Changes in technology, hopefully, would only increase our supply. If a change in technology decreases your supply curve, it's bad technology and you need to get rid of it, right? So it hopefully should only move us in the rightward shift, rightward direction. Change in the price of resources. This is another obvious one. The cheaper the resources, the more you're able to buy them and able to produce. More expensive the resources, obviously that's going to go in the opposite direction. It's going to make it you less able to produce because you just can't afford as many resources. This third one, when I ask students to try and explain this, I usually get something different than what it actually implies. So this one's a little tricky. Change in the price of other goods. Students usually start throwing out demand concepts to me. Well, because consumers are demanding, but no. We're talking about supply. If you're a supplier, how would the price of other goods being produced impact you, right? Oh, okay, I see. This is the answer I get a lot, Jennifer, is about substitutes or complementary goods. Let's save that for consumer expectations. Nope, this isn't quite the same thing. This is actually from the supplier side. Does this relate to competition? Maybe. This is actually from a supplier's perspective about goods that you could be producing instead. So a good example, farmers do this all the time. If you're growing corn and you're in the corn market and you're supplying corn in that market, if the price of corn goes down, or if the price of soy goes up, you're no longer going to be willing and able, it's the willingness part really, willing to supply to the corn market, and you're going to want to supply to the soy market instead. So it's really, as a producer, as a supplier, thinking about what kind of capital you already have, what kind of resources you already have, and whether you could get into a market with higher price goods, which provides a higher profit for you. Does that make sense? Okay. So when we talk about the hot dog example, Jennifer, like complementary goods, that has to do more with consumer expectations about what's going to happen in the market and therefore how to produce accordingly. So if you are a hot dog bun producer and you know 4th of July is coming up and people typically buy a lot of hot dogs around 4th of July, you would then ramp up your production because you have an expectation, right? That people are also going to buy more hot dog buns near the 4th of July. So that would be more under this example. If you produce Easter candy, right? You clearly have an expectation about when people are going to want the Easter candy and when they're going to stop wanting Easter candy, right? And you're going to produce accordingly. You're going to supply accordingly. And the supply curve for Easter candy is going to decrease after Easter and is going to ramp up again or increase probably around the 1st of the year as you start to build your stockpiles, okay? The last one, change in the number of producers. This one's pretty straightforward. Yes, of Starburst jelly beans. They don't produce those year round, do they? Garrett, do you have firsthand information? Yeah, I'm not sure either. All right. So changes in the number of consumers, in producers is just like a change in the number of consumers. If you have changes of the sheer population in your market, whether it's a population of producers or consumers, obviously that's going to create a change for demand, or in our case, supply of goods. If you have more pizza producers in your market, you just get more pizzas. It's pretty simple. All right, and I showed you a similar graph. Sorry about all my like titles and things. We're in edit mode. So I showed you something like this with demand, and this is really just an illustration to show you the exact same thing. And it's that when we have a shift in a curve, it's not the prices that are changing, it's the quantities that are changing at every given price. So we did the same thing with demand, but it holds true for supply as well. When you shift the supply to the right, which is an increase, right? You still have $12 pizzas, you just have more of them, okay? Here's the other thing with the supply curve that throws people off. Another reason why I wanted to throw this illustration. It's because a lot of people look at the original supply curve, the dark red one, and then look at the shift to the pink one, and they say, oh, well, supply's going down because the new supply curve is underneath the old one, so it looks like it's going down. No, 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 it's going to the right. And the right is an increase, right? And the left is a decrease. Supply curve throws people off, right? Because if you shift the supply curve to the left, it looks like it's going up or it's above your original. No, no, no. Right is an increase, left is a decrease, period. Okay? No matter what kind of curve we're talking about. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about markets, because there's really no sense in talking anymore about supply and demand individually, because you can't actually get a lot of information from just a supply or just a demand curve. What we do is we bring those two together, we create markets. That's the important thing, right? Is the market, which is, remember, it's that place where buyers and sellers converge. It's all the arrangements used to buy or sell a particular good or service. Markets are efficient. There's a reason markets exist, and there is a reason they look the way that they do, and that the bigger they get, actually, sometimes, most of the time, the more efficient they get. Because markets reduce transaction costs. Transaction costs, the time, the energy, the information you need to participate in exchange. When you go to the grocery store and there's everything you need, it cuts down on your transaction costs. Not only yours, but the producers as well. They have a pretty efficient, effective way to get you the goods they want to sell, and you have a really efficient place to go to get them. Markets can be big, they can be small, right? It can be eBay, it can be Safeway, it can be the farmer's market that they have in Flag on Sundays. You know, anything's really a market that cuts down on those transaction costs. Market equilibrium. So when you bring supply and demand together, they intersect on a graph. One is downward sloping, one is upward sloping. They typically collide or cross at one given point, a very specific point. Are there instances where they cross at a couple of points? Yeah, it's possible. We're not going to talk about that, okay? We're going to talk about one equilibrium in each market. There is an equilibrium point that exists when supply and demand intersect, and a corresponding price on the y-axis and a corresponding quantity on the x-axis. We call that equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price, okay? When our market is at equilibrium, it would imply that every single good that's being produced is also being sold. It's market clearing. It's ideal, it's perfect. It is the perfect scenario in a market, is to operate at equilibrium. Here's the problem. The problem is that supply and demand are shifting all the time. Both of them, really, for the most part, in most cases, are shifting all the time, at least a little bit. And so this equilibrium point is like this moving target that we're constantly trying to chase. And there are built-in mechanisms in the market that actually drive the market towards equilibrium. So we typically hover in that general area, but it's really hard to get it right, get it exact, because we're constantly chasing it, okay? Now, many times, because we're in the process of chasing equilibrium, we end up with shortages of goods and surpluses of goods as a result. A shortage means there's more demand than supply, and a surplus means there's more supply than demand. We're going to talk a lot about this, okay? And we're going to talk, I'm going to show you a graph here next, and we're going to talk about this exertion on this pressure that is put on price when we have shortages or surpluses, okay? All right, so let me show you the picture real quick. We'll come back if we need to. So here is that pizza market that you see right here. That's that demand curve you already saw. That's that supply curve that you already saw. And what we're going to do here is we're going to walk through a couple scenarios about overpricing pizzas and underpricing pizzas. It happens all the time, okay, to some extent, because we're chasing that point C, that equilibrium price right there, okay? We can see that the equilibrium price for pizza in this market is $9, and the equilibrium quantity is 20 million pizzas. What happens if producers, some producers in our market, overprice pizzas at $12. Well, if we look up at $12 and we follow that horizontal dotted line, right, and we follow it and it'll hit demand first, right, at 14 million pizzas, and then we keep going and it'll hit supply then at 24 million pizzas. We have then a 10 million pizza surplus in this market. Well, what good is a 10 million pizza surplus? It just doesn't make any sense, right? To produce 10 million extra pizzas. Well, when you price anything above market equilibrium, it's going to create a surplus. And that surplus in and of itself is going to exert downward pressure on the price. This market wants to be at point C, and it's going to get pretty darn close because of that exertion on price. If you think about what happens at the end of the day when you've produced, I don't know, each individual producer, let's say I produce 100 extra pizzas. The end of the day, what's going to happen to those pizzas? When my doors close, what happens to those 100 extra pizzas? You're not going to make any money off them, right? You throw them away. Theoretically, you'd throw them away, give them away, whatever. So probably before that happens, or the next day, or whatever, you start to question why you're producing all those extra pizzas. And you probably start to think about what you were going to do with all those extra pizzas before you actually close down, okay? So if you get to 7 o'clock and you close at 8 and you have 100 extra pizzas, what are you going to do with those pizzas? You're going to throw them away at the end of the night. What are you going to do instead? You're going to mark them down, right? You're going to sell them for cheaper just to get rid of them and just to recoup some of your money. That's that downward pressure on the price. Anytime you see something in the clearance anywhere, a surplus has been produced. And that is now exerting downward pressure on the price, right? And they're going to keep marking it down and marking it down and marking it down and marking it down until they either get rid of everything or it gets to the point where they end up donating, right? Because it's not worth anything to anybody. So that downward exertion is an important thing to note about a surplus. Let's work it from the other side. So if we underprice pizzas, so in this case, $6, and you work your way across horizontally on that dashed line, you'll see that we hit supply first. So supply's the lowest here. That's why it's a shortage, right? At 16 million, and then you keep working your way over to demand and you're at 26 million. We now have a 10 million pizza shortage at $6 per pizza. Well, if you're pizza producers, right? If you're a pizza producer and you're out of pizzas at 5 p.m., you're going to figure out you've priced them wrong, right? And that is going to start to exert upward pressure on the price as you figure out that $6 is too low and you need to then mark up your pizzas, you can make more profit, etc. Garrett asks, where do you get the information to make the original curve? Garrett, that's a marketing professional really would have this job of trying to go out there, do market research, try and create what they believe is a demand curve and a supply curve for that market. That's where you get the original information. But for most of us, starting up a business, yeah, we do some market research and we try and figure out what other firms were selling that was similar to ours and what prices that they were selling that good at. And that's how we as an individual would probably look to set original pricing in our market. So depends on if you're looking for all market information or just market information relative to your good. Yeah. because we know not all pizzas are created equal, right? And so if you have underpriced pizzas, it's going to create a shortage. It's going to exert upward pressure on the price. But we actually end up with a third thing that happens when we do this. When we have shortages of goods in our society, we actually have something that is called secondary markets that emerges here. Because we're a pretty savvy society, because we lean towards that capitalist side. If you are somebody who recognizes that a good is being sold at a price that is too low, and that eventually that's going to create a shortage, what might you do? Even if you don't want it. Thoughts? People do it all the time. Yeah, resale, right? We have this beautiful mechanism for resale called eBay, where you can actually put a good and you can let people bid against each other to find the absolute maximum somebody is willing to pay for a good. I mean, that's a pretty efficient way to sell goods, is find the person that's willing to pay the most for it, because they think that they will receive that benefit, that they are willing to pay that price for it. And finding the person who values something the most, it's a pretty efficient way to distribute goods, right? Makes a lot of profit for the person who's reselling, and potentially provides a lot of benefit to the person who's buying it. This happens every year, you know, with different goods, especially around Christmas time, right? There's this toy that gets all this buzz and every kid wants it, and they sell out and nobody can find them, and everybody's kids crying if they don't get them on Christmas, and it's all this pressure, right? And so everybody's scrambling to try and find this thing. If you can get your hands on it, right, sky's the limit, because you have opened up this secondary market for those goods. Somebody's going to make that profit one way or another, right? This is the society that we live in. When I was 10, right, before I knew anything about secondary markets, I wanted this Cabbage Patch doll, this doll that, I mean, it literally, people were dying in riots over these dolls. And they were selling out, nobody could get their hands on them, but my grandmother was determined, okay? So she went to some store, stood in some crazy line, and gets in there. And the first lady in line didn't actually want any dolls. But what she did is she took them off the shelf as fast as she could and piled them around her. And you could pay her $40. She's in the store. You could pay her $40 to pick one out of her pile, and then you could go pay the $20 to get it out the door. That's how underpriced they were. This was a pricing issue. The company who produced them could have sold them for $60 a piece like that. But instead, they just didn't realize how underpriced the good was. And so somebody else was going to make that profit, right? They've existed since the beginning of time, secondary market, okay? All right, moving on. So why does equilibrium price and quantity change? Well, it's because a curve shift. Yes, a curve shifts. And it could be a singular curve, either supply or demand, but it is more commonly both that are shifting really at the same time. So let me go through some graphs of shifts and changes in equilibrium price and quantity. This is important because it is a critical thinking exercise that probably pretty closely mimics something I would do on an exam. And because I won't ask a question like, what causes a change in equilibrium price and quantity? I'll give you a specific scenario and I'll expect you to be able to think through it, okay? Cause and effect. So for example, if I were to ask you what happens to equilibrium price when demand in a market increases, some of you can do this in your head and some of you cannot. I suspect a bulk of you cannot. And that a visual would be much more beneficial in trying to answer this question. So if I were giving this exam in a classroom, I would actually expect to get these paper exams back and have all these tiny little graphs drawn in the margin as you're trying to visualize the answer to the question. You should be prepared on an exam to be drawing little graphs and shifting little curves so that you can actually visualize and draw for yourself the answer to the question. So what's the answer to that question? What happens to equilibrium price when the demand curve increases? Well, we went from point C, which was our original equilibrium, to point G, which is our new equilibrium after our demand curve shifted to the right because of the increase. You can see that equilibrium price went from $9 to $12. So the answer to the question is it increased. What happened to equilibrium quantity? Well, it went from 20 to 24, so it increased as well. So price and equilibrium price and quantity both went up when the demand for a good increased. Some of you already know that, right? It came to you right away. Some of you are like, oh my God, how am I going to answer that question, right? Get used to drawing these little graphs. It gets a whole lot more complicated. And that's why I think drawing can help keep all the details straight. Okay, so let's do supply really quick. Okay, so we start at point C, right? This was our equilibrium in our pizza market, because they're at point C, $9.20 million units. Supply increased, moved to the right, and our new equilibrium now is at that point D. You can see that price went down, equilibrium price went down, and equilibrium quantity went up. So when we're talking about supply increasing, price actually goes down and quantity goes up. That might not be so intuitive. And then, as if that wasn't enough, let's do it both together. Let's increase supply and demand at the same time, because that's definitely more realistic than just one of them shifting, okay? But it gets even more complicated because a lot of times they're not shifting at the same rate. Sometimes we see a little shift in one and a big shift in the other, right? It's not always a consistent shift between both because there are different factors that drive the shifts in both. So let's look at the first scenario, right? So we start at point A, that's our original equilibrium. And then we can see the supply curve shifts, increases a little bit, and the demand curve increases a lot. And we end up with a new equilibrium there at point B. So we see price went up a little and quantity went up a lot. This is impossible to memorize, all the different scenarios. If one's increasing and one's decreasing, one's increasing a lot, one's decreasing a little, and there's no reason to memorize it as much as you have to get comfortable with drawing the shifts and then reanalyzing your changes in equilibrium, okay? All right, the second one, we see an increase in supply and demand as well. But you can see in the second graph, demand increased a little bit and supply increased a lot. Something different happens. We're both seeing increases, right? In both graphs are seeing increases in both curves, but at different rates. And so you can see the difference between the two graphs. I mean, the price increases on the first graph and decreases on the second. Quantity increases with both, right? But these are just two examples of how those curves could be shifting. If I give you an exam question that says this curve shifts a little, increase or decrease, this one shifts a lot, increase or decrease, you just need to draw a really exaggerated graph, and that should help you determine what's going on, right? Just put an X in the middle of the page for your, or in the middle of the graph for your original equilibrium, and then do a very exaggerated or a very minute shift if I say one shifts more than the other, and that will give you a really clear picture about what's happening to equilibrium price and quantity. It's not that hard if you just get comfortable with drawing your own graphs, okay? All right. So let's move on to a concept called disequilibrium. Disequilibrium is any amount of time or point in time in which a market is not in equilibrium. Well, that's most of the time, except for a special kind of disequilibrium, and that is a government-imposed disequilibrium. The government does this all the time. In markets, you don't even realize they're doing it. And that is that they impose a disequilibrium on a market. And they say, in this market, because we are intervening, because we feel like there's going to be market failure, we are going to set minimum or maximum selling prices on these goods. A price floor is a minimum selling price that, if it is imposed high, above market equilibrium, will actually bind the market and the price can't ever get to equilibrium. So floors are imposed high in a market, and ceilings are imposed low in a market. If it's a maximum selling price below equilibrium, it can't get up to equilibrium, okay? This is a common mistake students make, is they think floors, right? Intuitively, we're like, well, floors are down here and ceilings are up there. Nope. It's disrupting a market. It would disrupt you if I put your floors up there and your ceilings down here, right? It disrupts a market if you put them in the opposite place, right? Ceilings high and floors low. It binds that market. It seizes it up. And it can never, ever, ever reach equilibrium, okay? So let's look at these graphs real quick. I know we're running out of time. This first one is a price floor. Another great example of a price floor is minimum wage. Okay, it's the one we probably talk about more than any, but we do have a price floor in milk here in this country as well. The government has come into the milk market, and instead of letting you and I buy milk for $1.90, which is equilibrium price, and buy 19 million gallons of milk, they've decided that that's not a high enough price. And so they've imposed a price floor, which will create a disequilibrium in the market at $2.50. It creates a surplus, right? It's a price above market, creates a surplus. It exerts downward pressure on the price. Here's the difference. We can't get to equilibrium. We'll never get to equilibrium. The pressure's still there though. Don't think the pressure disappears just because the government's doing it, right? Pressure's still there. Why would the government impose a price floor on milk? What it means is you and I get less milk at a higher price. The American public gets less milk at a higher price. Why would they do that? Bailing out the dairy industry. Okay, so this is twofold. Okay, this is complicated. So first of all, we got to be careful with our food supply. We do want to keep our food supply going and abundant so that if we need more, we can make more. It's a thing, right? That makes sense. The dairy industry also is kind of inefficient and hires a lot of lobbyists to go to DC and petition politicians to put these in place. Because what's better for business than getting a higher price and producing less without having to do anything but get a politician to see it your way and put a price floor in place that benefits you, okay? They win, we as the American public lose in terms of money, in terms of price. We get to keep our dairy industry, which to some extent, yeah, it's a good thing, right? I don't know how much we need to keep, but it's really our small producers, probably more than anybody, that gets bailed out here, okay? And then quickly over here, we have price ceilings. A good price ceiling example, and it's your authors, is rent control on apartments in big cities and things like that. This happens all the time, right? So market equilibrium price for rent is 1,000. Government swoops in and says, no, in these areas, in these apartments, we're going to put a price ceiling on rent at $600. It creates a shortage. Everybody wants it. There's not enough available. It puts upward pressure on the price. Price can't get there. The pressure still exists. And it opens up secondary markets again. People who get their hands on rent-controlled apartments don't give them up. They rent them out. Even if they don't want to live in them anymore, just like if you don't want the Cabbage Patch doll, it doesn't matter, right? Get it. And then if you don't want it, resell it to somebody and make yourself some profit. Okay? So the pressure is still there. But what happens here? If you're a landlord and you were getting $1,000 a unit for your apartments, the government comes in and says you only get $600. What's the downside to this? You're the landlord. Anybody know what happens in rent-controlled apartments? Yeah, I'm not sinking any extra money into that property if I own it. I can tell you that for sure. And so they end up with living conditions then that are more in the 600 range because that's what they're paying, right? So there's an upside and a downside. A lot of this is highly political, right? We don't really get into, but just understanding that these price floors and price ceilings exist, they create constant disequilibrium and really have the same impacts as if you were overpricing or underpricing a good, except for they bind and that price can't move, okay? All right, that's all I have for today.